Friends, today I am going to talk to you on an important topic, namely the status of the three organs of the state in the year 1950 and in the year 2020. During these 70 years, certain developments have taken place which I want to bring to your notice. As you know, under the Constitution, there are three organs of the state: legislature, executive, and the judiciary. Now, by legislature, I mean the parliament and the state legislatures. But here we are mainly concerned with the parliament only, because so far as state legislatures are concerned, the status is almost the same both in 1950 as well as in 2020. So far as parliament is concerned, it is authorized to enact laws in central list, that is known as list 1 in the Constitution. The topics regarding which the Parliament can enact laws are stated therein. Similarly, regarding the subjects on which state can legislate are found in state list, that is list number 2. Then there is another list, list number 3, which is called a concurrent list regarding the subjects which both the state and the parliament together have power to enact legislation. Now, so far as parliament is concerned, apart from the power to enact legislation on topics in the central list, the parliament is also empowered to amend any provision of the Constitution. Under Article 368, the Parliament is given this power to amend the Constitution. Now, soon after the Constitution came into force, it became necessary for the Parliament to amend the Constitution to get over some judgments of the courts of law which struck down some enactments on the ground that they were violative of the fundamental rights of the citizens. This prompted the Parliament to amend the Constitution by amending the Constitution, and those constitutional amendments were also challenged, but the Supreme Court upheld all the amendments, holding that the power of the Parliament to amend the Constitution is unlimited and the same is beyond any doubt. This position continued for next several years until the year 1973, when the case of Keshavananda Bharati came up for consideration before the Supreme Court of India. This case involved the interpretation of Article 368 of the Constitution, and the question before the court was whether the power of the Parliament to amend the Constitution under Article 368 is totally unlimited, or are there any implied limitations on this power of amendment. The matter was referred to a larger bench of 13 judges. That is the only case in which the 13 judges sat to hear a matter in the Indian Supreme Court. After hearing matter for about 68 days, the Supreme Court delivered a very important judgment. The opinion of all the judges of the Supreme Court was not unanimous. While 7 judges held that though the power of Parliament to amend the Constitution is vast, it does not authorize the Parliament to effect any amendment which alters the basic structure or framework of the Constitution. This, according to the majority view, was the law. As against this, 6 judges dissented and held that the power of the Parliament to amend the Constitution is beyond any limitation and the restriction placed by the majority is not correct. However, since it was the majority decision, that became the law of the land. Naturally, the executive was very unhappy with this development, and therefore an attempt was made to get this judgment reviewed, but that attempt also failed. Subsequently, the Supreme Court, the Parliament also enacted some more amendments so as to render status quo by having full power to the Parliament to amend the Constitution, but all those attempts have also failed. With the result, as on today, the majority view in Keshavananda's case stands. That is, the power of the Parliament to amend is restricted. It cannot amend any article of the Constitution which affects the basic structure of the Constitution. In fact, after 1970 till now, several constitutional amendments were effected by the Parliament, but most of them have been struck down by the Supreme Court on the ground that they affected or altered the basic structure of the Constitution, and therefore that could not become the law. So, as on today, the law is clear, and therefore, as between 1950 and 2020, one major difference in the status of the Parliament in relation to its power to amend the Constitution is fundamentally altered. While in 1950, the Parliament had unlimited power of amending, as on today, after the year 1973, that power is restricted by the judgment which said that you can have no amendment which will alter the basic structure of the Constitution. The total effect is the Parliament is deprived of its one important power in relation to amendment of the Constitution. This is so far as legislature is concerned. Now I will come to the executive. The central executive is the central government. Now under the Constitution, the power of appointment of judges of the Supreme Court and the High Court, as also power of transfer of the judges of the High Court, vested with the President of India. That means President who acts on the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers. So virtually the power of appointment vested with the central government, because the Constitution specifically said President will appoint in consultation with the Chief Justice of India. So the only requirement for the central government was that before recommending appointment to the President, who will act according to the opinion of the central government, CJI had to be consulted. It was not a case of concurrence. His consent was not necessary. Mere consultation was enough. And this is how the power under the constitution originally vested with the central government so far as appointment of the Supreme Court judges and High Court judges, as also regarding transfer of the High Court judges. This was the position, and this position continued right from the year 1950 till the year 1993. That is, for about 43 years, this was the position. However, there were many complaints that this power of appointment being with the executive, that was being misused, and instead of appointing judges with merit, on account of political and other considerations, even people without merit were also appointed. Barring that criticism, during emergency, whenever there was any judgment rendered was against the interest of the central government headed by Mrs. Indira Gandhi went to the extent of transferring those judges by way of punishment. This was also resented by the people in general because the power vested in the executive is being misused. There was yet another power which was with the central government, and that was confirming the additional judges of the High Court as permanent judges. Even that power was misused by declining to confirm some judges who gave judgments against the interest of the government. In fact, I refer to the case of Keshavananda Bharati earlier, where by majority the power of Parliament to amend Constitution was restricted. The majority judgment was rendered by 7 judges, of whom 3 were Justice Shalat, Justice K. Segde and Justice Grover. Now, within few days of the judgment, the central government headed by Mrs. Gandhi superseded them and appointed a junior judge, Justice A.N. Ray, as the Chief Justice of India by breaking the convention. Similarly, Justice H.R. Khanna, whose dissenting judgment in ADM Jabalpur case was not to the liking of the central government, was also superseded, and his junior was appointed as a Chief Justice of India. All these matters were matters of concern to the general public as also to a section of the judiciary. In the circumstances, there was an attempt to see that this power of the central government to appoint judges and transfer them is somehow taken away. With that idea, a public interest litigation was filed before the Supreme Court, in which a contention was urged that in the matter of appointment of judges, and when I say judges, judges of the Superior Court, that is the High Court and the Supreme Court, the power should not be vested with the executive, and in case of any difference of opinion between the central government and the Chief Justice of India, the opinion of Chief Justice of India should prevail and the opinion of the executive should yield. A theory was developed that in the matter of appointment of judges, there was primacy in the Chief Justice of India. This question was considered by a bench of 7 judges of the Supreme Court. But after detailed hearing in that case, which is known as case of S.P. Gupta, and it is also known as First Judge's case, of the 7 judges, majority 4 judges held in favor of the executive. They held that the correct interpretation of the constitution is it is the right of the executive to appoint, therefore the central government had the right of appointment with only one condition, that before such appointment the central government must consult the Chief Justice of India. And in the matter of consultation, the Supreme Court clarified the consultation should not be a farce, but it should be very effective and meaningful. Whenever there is such a effective consultation, ultimate decision is of the central government. Thus, the central government once again succeeded in preserving his right regarding appointment of judges to the superior courts. But there the matter did not end. There were many interested parties, as also many judges who wanted further efforts to be made to divest the executive of this power which was being misused, mostly during the emergency also. Therefore, after some time, when some public interest litigation came up for hearing, 3 judges of the Supreme Court felt that the judgment rendered by the majority in S.P. Gupta's case is erroneous and the same requires reconsideration. The Chief Justice of India immediately accepted that position, and since the case of S.P. Gupta was decided by a bench of 7 judges, he constituted a bench of 9 judges to reconsider the decision in S.P. Gupta's case. So this case, which is known as second judge's case, actually it was a writ petition filed by Advocates on Record Association versus Union of India. In that case, 9 judges of the Supreme Court considered the matter in great detail. In fact, the case was heard for a very long time. And as Advocate General of the state, I had the privilege of addressing these 9 judges in that second judge's case. After hearing all the parties, by a majority judgment, majority of 7:2, the Supreme Court reversed or overruled the judgment in S.P. Gupta's case, and for the first time held that in the matter of appointment of judges to the higher judiciary and also in the matter of transfer of judges and confirmation of additional judges, the primacy of the Chief Justice of India was upheld. The court held that whenever there is any difference of opinion between the Chief Justice of India and the central government, the opinion of the Chief Justice of India will prevail. However, they added that it will not be the opinion of Chief Justice of India individually alone, but it will be his opinion with that of 2 of his senior-most colleagues. This judgment for the first time evolved this theory of collegium of the Supreme Court, which has to take a final decision in the matter. Chief Justice of India and 2 senior-most judges constitute the collegium so far as Supreme Court is concerned, but in a later ruling they clarified that so far as the Supreme Court is concerned, it should be Chief Justice of India and 4 other judges. In the case of High Court judges, it will be collegium will consist of only 3 judges, that is Chief Justice of India and 2 senior most colleagues. Now, this decision virtually unsettled the position which was prevailing in the country right from the year 1950 till 1993, till the date of this judgment in the second judge's case. It was widely felt in legal circles that this judgment is clearly erroneous because it is the result of erroneous interpretation of the provisions in the Constitution. While the Constitution said the President shall appoint, that is, central government will appoint, the power of appointment and selection came to be vested with the Chief Justice of India and his colleagues, who are known as this collegium. This is contrary to the plain text of the section. It also altered the basic feature of the Constitution. Therefore, by and large, there were complaints that this decision is erroneous. However erroneous the decision may be, it became the law of the land, and the whole effect of it was that a very important power with regard to appointment of judges to the superior judiciary is taken away from the central government and vested with the Supreme Court of India. This is a fundamental difference effected so far as the executive is concerned. So I can say that from between the year 1950 and as on today, the difference is from 1950 till 93, the power vested with the executive, and as on today, after 93 till now, the power vests with the Supreme Court collegium. This is the fundamental difference brought about, which is actually a loss of the power of the executive, namely the central government. So to this extent, the power of Parliament is affected by taking away its unlimited power of amending the Constitution. So far as central government is concerned, its absolute power of appointment of judges subject only to consultation with the Chief Justice of India is totally taken away, and the whole power is vested with the collegium of the Supreme Court. These are the major changes brought about so far as the legislature and the executive is concerned. Now, I will come to the question of the status and position of the judiciary. So far as the judiciary is concerned, you will find that while the legislature and the executive lost some of their very important powers during this period, so far as the judiciary and in particular the Supreme Court is concerned, its powers got enhanced enormously, as I will be explaining hereafter. Now, when the Constitution came into force also, the Supreme Court of India and the High Courts had vast powers even of issuing writs. The Supreme Court had the power, and both the Supreme Court as well as the High Courts had power even to strike down a legislation passed by a competent legislature, whether it be the parliament or the state legislature. Now, an enactment of a legislature could be struck down by the courts on one of the two grounds. One is incompetency of the legislature. If the legislature had no competence to pass the particular legislation, it could be struck down. Or the other is that the legislation is in contravention of any provisions of the Constitution, in which event it will become unconstitutional. These were the only two grounds on which an ordinary legislation could be struck down. So far as a Constitution amendment is concerned, it could have been struck down only if the procedure prescribed by the Constitution had not been followed. Barring these, there was no other ground on which a legislative enactment could have been struck down. When this was the position, in course of time, the Supreme Court, in the course of deciding cases, expanded its powers. Initially, in 70s, interpreting Article 14 of the Constitution, the Supreme Court said, in addition to providing for equality clause and providing discrimination, providing protection against discrimination, there is also yet another aspect involved in Article 14 of the Constitution. By way of interpretation, the Supreme Court held that Article 14 involved a principle of non-arbitrariness. The court held that any action of the state should be fair and reasonable, and if anything is not fair and reasonable, that will be treated as arbitrary, and non-arbitrariness is an essential component of Article 14. Therefore, the Supreme Court evolved a new ground to strike down any legislation or an executive action, and that is to say that it is an arbitrary act. Therefore, it is liable to be struck down. But all through the Supreme Court as well as the High Courts held that on the ground of arbitrariness, you can strike down only subordinate legislation or an executive action, but not a plenary legislation. That was the position till about 1 or 2 years back. But now, some time back, the Supreme Court went a step further, that even a plenary legislation passed by the competent legislature is liable to be struck down if the court feels that that legislation is manifestly arbitrary. This, in my opinion, is enlarging the scope too much. For one thing, it is a settled principle of law that a court cannot question the wisdom of the legislature. So, if 500 members of the parliament thought that a particular legislation is reasonable and they pass it, two judges of the court can't say, we say it is manifestly arbitrary and strike it down. Therefore, this is one way by which the Supreme Court expanded its power of striking down not only subordinate legislation but also a plenary legislation. And very recently, within the last 1 year or so, the Supreme Court has evolved one more principle, and that is called constitutional morality. They say though certain things are not stated in the constitution, we assume that there is a principle of constitutional morality which has to be culled out from a consideration of all the provisions of the constitution, and if we find that any legislation is opposed to constitutional morality also, we can strike it down. This again, I submit, is not correct, and these two principles of constitutional morality and manifest arbitrariness have given rise for conflict between the judiciary and the executive. In fact, the Attorney General for India, Sri K. Venugopal, has strongly criticized this concept of constitutional morality. In fact, in Sabarimala case, 4 judges have given 4 different meanings to this expression, and one judge used it to strike down the rule, the other judge used it to uphold the rule. So this is a very vague concept, and this evolving of new concepts and getting more power to strike down legislation validly passed by the legislature is a step in the wrong direction. Then another important power which the Supreme Court got, which it did not have in 1950, because of the judgment in Keshavananda's case, what is basic structure, what is not, is also to be decided only by the Supreme Court. So this case gave the Supreme Court additional power of striking down any constitutional amendment on the ground that it is opposed to basic structure of the Constitution. This is a very important power, and this has been exercised by the Supreme Court to strike down so many constitutional amendments, including the 99th Constitution Amendment relating to appointment of judges, to which I will come little later. Then another important power, and this is the most important, I should have stated it first, very important power which the Supreme Court got, which it did not have from 1950 to 93, is the power of selection and appointment of judges to the superior judiciary. I have already explained with regard to the loss of the executive, that power was lost by the executive, and that power is gained by the Supreme Court of India. So this power, transfer of power from the executive to the judiciary, is an important matter which, according to me, virtually tilts the balance of power. Now, among the 3 organs, the Constitution has taken care to see that all the 3 organs are equal and they act only within their power. And in distributing the power, care had been taken to see that there is constitutional balance. Now that balance is now tilted heavily in favor of the judiciary as against the in derogation of the right of the executive. This is another aspect of the matter which has enhanced the power of the Supreme Court. Yet another important power which the Supreme Court assumed is by evolving this new theory of public interest litigation. Now till about 1970-75, there was no scope for there was no practice of public interest litigation. The principle of locus standi prevailed. Only one is aggrieved can approach a court. And citizen cannot approach a court on behalf of somebody or in behalf of public. But in 70s, this in principle of public interest litigation was evolved. The result is, in the beginning, such litigations were instituted for the benefit of certain weaker sections of the people who had no means to come to court. There were several sections of the people who were aggrieved, who were even denied ordinary human rights, but they had no means or capacity to come to court. For instance, bonded laborers, Adivasis, prisoners, and such other weaker sections. They all benefited by such this public interest litigation. So many judgments were passed in their favor. But subsequently, instead of such litigation, only mostly frivolous and vexatious public interest litigations were filed, which requested the court to grant relief by way of direction to the executive and the legislature, which matters were exclusively within the domain of the executive and legislature. So this public interest litigation gave scope for the High Courts and the Supreme Court to encroach upon the area reserved for executive and the legislature. This is one harm which is the result of public interest litigation. But as on today, it is, in my opinion, not helping anybody. Most frivolous and vexatious public interest litigations are filed claiming absurd and ridiculous reliefs. Therefore, as on today, even Supreme Court had occasion to express its concern over these litigations. I am tempted to quote one decision of the Supreme Court in the case of Aravali Gold Club versus so and so. It is reported in 2008. Before parting with this case, I quote, "Before parting with this case, we would like to make some observations about the limits of powers of the judiciary. We are compelled to make these observations because we are repeatedly coming across cases where judges are unjustifiably trying to perform executive or legislative functions. In our opinion, this is clearly unconstitutional. In the name of judicial activism, judges cannot cross their limits and try to take over functions which belong to another organ of the state. Under our constitution, the legislature, the executive and the judiciary all have their own broad spheres of operation. Ordinarily, it is not proper for any one of these organs of the state to encroach upon the domain of another. Otherwise, the delicate balance in the constitution will be upset and there will be reaction. Judges must know their limits and must not try to run the government. They must have modesty and humility and not behave like emperors. There is broad separation of powers under the constitution and each organ of the state, the legislature, executive and the judiciary, must have respect for the other and must not encroach into others' domain. And this mostly happens in the case of public interest litigation. And what is the effect of these public interest litigations as on today? I once again refer to the quotation from the Supreme Court judgment itself in the case of Common Cause versus Union, again reported in 2008 5 SCC. I quote, "Unfortunately, the truth is that PILs are being entertained by many courts as a routine, and the result is that the dockets of most of the superior courts are flooded with PILs, most of which are frivolous or for which the judiciary has no remedy. Thus, public interest litigation, which was initially created as a useful judicial tool to help the poor and weaker sections of the society who could not afford to come to courts, has in course of time largely developed into an uncontrollable Frankenstein and a nuisance which is threatening to choke the dockets of the superior courts, obstructing the hearing of genuine and regular cases which have been waiting to be taken up for years together." This is the effect of these public interest litigations which even the Supreme Court has chosen to term it as a nuisance. It is high time that this practice is put an end to, or at any rate restricted to minimum of cases. It is only in rarest of rare cases should the courts entertain public interest litigations, because as on today, vested interests have taken over this particular area. But all the same, we will see as between 1950 and 2020, this public interest litigation has given scope for the judiciary to encroach upon the field exclusively reserved either for the legislature or for the executive. Friends, have analyzed and tried to point out how in the course of last 70 years, legislature and executive have lost some of their important powers. The judiciary, and in particular the Supreme Court, has gained and has enhanced these powers not only on the judicial side but also on the executive side by getting the power of appointment of judges. Now, there is no doubt about it that if we consider the performance of the three organs of the government during these years, undoubtedly the judiciary has done far better than the other two organs. But that can be no reason to encroach upon the area of the others or to create an imbalance among the organs of the state. I therefore respectfully put forward three suggestions in all humility. First is that the Supreme Court of India must realize the position that the majority judgment in second judge's case as well as the NJAC case are erroneous, and therefore by constituting a larger bench, the Supreme Court should divest itself of the power of appointment of judges to the superior judiciary because of the vast criticism regarding functioning of the collegium. Now, I am not suggesting that this power should be transferred back to the executive. Executive also has misused that power, particularly during emergency and even thereafter. All that I am suggesting is that NJAC Act is a very fair legislation which had been entrusted with the power of selecting candidates. As you have noticed, under the Act, there are only 6 members with predominant position to the judiciary. Of the 6 members, Chief Justice and his 2 senior-most colleagues are there. Then executive is represented by only one, that is the Union Law Minister. Then 2 eminent people to be selected by a committee of such high position, was people of such high position as Chief Justice of India, Prime Minister of India and Leader of the Opposition. This is a commission which I feel is adequately represented. Judiciary is represented, executive is represented to the minimum, civil society is represented by 2 eminent people. Such an independent body can be entrusted with the task of selecting the right people to hold such important position, because as I have explained earlier, the judiciary today wields such extensive powers. Therefore, it is necessary that proper people with integrity and qualification should be selected. I am not saying that the selection by the collegium has always been bad, but the experience has shown that in many cases deserving candidates have not been selected, and that is the complaint, and therefore it is but proper that the selection process should be entrusted to the independent body like the National Judicial Commission. Supreme Court alone can see that this NJAC Act comes into force and the same is implemented in the interest of all concerned. The second suggestion that I am making is that the judiciary should try to see that it does not encroach upon the domain of the other 2 organs and try as far as possible to stop this practice of PIL, which even according to Supreme Court has become a nuisance, or at any rate entertain PIL in rarest of rare cases. And the third thing that I submit with in all humility is the Supreme Court should desist from evolving new grounds to strike down legislation such as this theory of manifest arbitrariness and constitutional morality, etc. These are my humble suggestions. And one more last suggestion which I would like to make is that the superior courts, and in particular the Supreme Court, must follow the tradition of the Privy Council and try to write short judgments so that a common man can easily know what the law is. But today the trend is very lengthy judgments are passed, not only very lengthy judgments, but also so many concurring judgments. I can understand in one case If it is a judgment where all are agreed, it could be only one judgment. Or if there is a majority view and a dissenting view, there could be two judgments. But 3 or 4 concurring judgments running into hundreds of pages is only creating confusion. Even the legal profession or experienced lawyers find it difficult to find out what the ratio of a case is. I may be pardoned for making this suggestion. I feel writing of brief judgments will ultimately help in the interest of justice. Thank you for your patience.